Hi, welcome to artwithkorb.com. This is Mr. Roberts demonstrating using a frame to put around your stained glass. Enjoy!
And it just has, around so you guys can see, it just has a channel for your glass to fit inside. Okay? When we cut this stuff, the goal is to keep it in one piece and just cut out little notches and then bend it 90 degree. Those little tools there that I just pulled out, those make the cuts that you want. So if you guys can kind of see the channel in here, that's where your glass fits inside there. It fits in kind of snug. So that's why I mentioned while you were soldering, if you solder too far out to the edges or all the way to the edge, sometimes it's hard to get that to fit inside you. And so if you did that, you're going to have to melt a little bit of solder off the edge. And I'll plug in and show you what that looks like here in a minute. So if it doesn't fit, you're going to have to do that. This one should fit fine, I think. But I'll melt a little solder off of this thing so you can see that anyway. Okay? One of you guys grab me your Sharpie. I forgot my Sharpie. You can probably get, I would say, at least 2 of you guys for one of these frames. Definitely 2, maybe 3, depending on your piece. And the first thing that I would do is just give yourself a rough cut on the frame. So I'm just going to take my project. You can use a ruler. You can just kind of use the actual side of your piece. You can measure the perimeter, measure it out on here. I give myself an extra 2 inches usually, or an inch or so. So I have some room to work with. But we'll do this. We got one side, 2 sides, a little bit over here, small side, and then, like I said, maybe an extra inch or so. That should give me some leftover room to work with. All right. Now, these tools are going to be in. There's a little bin over in the left cabinet with scrap glass that has a bunch of these in there. Some of them have notes on the bottom. Like this one says zinc, silver, fits snug. We have some brass and copper frames as well that were just a little different size. So I think I designated one of these for those. If there's no note on there, it probably works just fine. One thing I wanted to note though, and this one I should note. If you look at this thing, there's a little shape in there, which is basically a punch cut out. Put the frame in there, squeeze the thing, and it punches out that little shape out of the frame. You guys can see this one's a square. Okay? Now, when I punch this, you'll see really quickly how this works. Some of them, or one of them, is more of kind of a diamond shape. And this one will not work for this frame. And I'll show you how in a minute. So it's a very small difference, but you've got to pay attention to it. Otherwise your frame doesn't work out. Okay? So I'm going to punch this on my line. Your frame goes down inside. Oh, this is the snug. Frame goes down inside the channel. You push down on it with your thumb, nice and tight so it doesn't move, and then click this thing. You'll hear it pop 2 times. 1 when it punches through the first side of the frame, and 2 when it punches through the second. 1, 2. All right. And it'll leave these little. Lost it. It'll leave these little metal punch outs. You'll have to sweep up later. Oh yeah, there's one. Okay. All right. So now, when you're actually making your frame, this will just create the area in which your frame bends. It should make a nice 90-degree angle. All right. For this is just my rough cut. I'm just going to bend this off of here because I don't need all of this extra stuff. So I'll just work with this one. This one can go to your partner or someone else at your table or whatever. Maybe we can get 3. Okay. Any leftover that we have, try to leave as much as possible, and I just throw it in the boxes over between the lockers and the cabinet there. I've got shorter boxes for shorter pieces and longer for longer. So we'll still use it. Even if your piece isn't long enough to wrap around the whole thing, it's still usable. but we'll kind of hold those off till later. It's more ideal to have a piece that's connected all the way around. It's just a little bit stronger, okay? All right, so this, I'm gonna cut this one just so you guys can see what this looks like. So this is the little diamond-shaped cutout, and you'll see that when I bend this over, it doesn't make a 90-degree angle. So you can see the difference there. When you're wrapping your frame around, if you cut with this one, you're not going to be able to get a 90. You're going to have to overbend this, and then it's going to kind of crumple these sides up, and you're not going to have a smooth corner. All right? Just be aware of that. All right. Now, I usually like to work in my board. Hopefully, you guys are starting to get to your skill level where you're able to pull nice smooth solder seams throughout the whole thing. There's no big areas where you had gaps, front and back side. I say front and back, but I'm a little reluctant to say that because these pieces, though I know you designed them with a certain orientation in mind, there is no front and back. They're both the front. Because if this is up somewhere, you're going to see it from this way, and you're going to see it from this way. So sometimes I'll have people say, well, the solder on my front looks good, but I kind of rushed on the back. The front and the back are the same. So when you're graded, you're going to be graded the same for both. Okay, so treat them that way. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find, I cut off that one that I needed. I'm going to find my end that has the angle cut on it. You don't want to start with a straight edge. Okay. If you cut off a tiny little bit like this, it's really hard to get it off of there. All right, so this angled part right here, that's going to go right in the very corner of your workboard. So you got to kind of clean off your workboards at this point and get all the glass off of them. Your glass is going to pull right inside, and that's why you want the workboard, because you can pull in against your frame. And I'm going to make a mark. Okay, this is where it gets a little bit specific. Okay, I'm going to make a mark just on the outside edge of my glass. I don't want it to be a Sharpie line bigger or a Sharpie line smaller. It's got to be right on the thing. And if you've got like an extra fine Sharpie, that sometimes is a little bit more accurate of a mark. Or when you're using these, just don't push down like a gorilla and just make a very light mark so it's really thin, and you'll be okay. All right? So now I'm gonna cut this with this tool. I'm gonna make this little notch in here. I want my Sharpie line to be right at the top of that square mark, so that Sharpie line is going to be the corner of that 90-degree little cutout. All right, and I've got to push in real hard so it doesn't move. Make sure I hear the click twice. And now, right where my Sharpie line was, it should be gone now. I've got a little notch there, and I can go ahead, bend that, and pull my glass back into it. Okay? Now I'm just going to keep on going. I'm going to pull this all the way, pulling everything into my board. Again, don't mark it like a gorilla, just a really light line right on the end. Now I'm going to take it out, do it again, and just repeat this 2 more times. The other thing that I will do sometimes, a piece like this, I know which orientation this frame should go. But if you've got a square, even though it's supposed to be a square, it's not going to fit around your piece in any way. So sometimes I'll make a little mark like on the foil here so that I know where the start of my frame was. So if, like, for example, if I flip this glass around and go this way, it just might not quite fit the same. So I'm going to make a little mark there so that I remember, okay, this is my start. Right? So now I'm going to bend this over. I've got to flip it around. pulling everything into the corner of my board. A light mark right on the outside. Make sure that when you do cut this, you're really pushing down on this thing so it doesn't move in there. I only heard one there, you guys notice that? And every time you put this back in your board, pull it all the way into the corner. Frame, panel, the whole thing. So this one bends. And now I've got a little bit of an overlap. Now I've got to cut this off so that those two 45-degree angles come together right at that point. I don't want a gap here. If you have a gap here, you're not going to be able to solder it closed. You're going to have to break this piece off and cut a new one to fit. So you don't want to do that, okay? So when I mark this one, and I'm pulling everything in tight, and I want to mark this right where that, it's going to be hard for me to describe this. I want to mark it right where the end of this frame matches up with that point there. Right? If you cut it too big, is that probably okay? Why would that be okay? What? Cut it again. But if you cut it too small, it doesn't work as much. So I want to be right on the very end of this frame, make my mark so you guys can see that. Again, light mark. If you have to take off a little bit, let's say it's like a 1/16 of an inch or like a couple millimeters too big, you can file. I've got some files I've used for metals class. You wouldn't probably be able to cut with this thing if it was just a sliver too big, but you can cut it with or file it down a little bit. So then my last one. Now this one just gets bent off of here and thrown in the garbage. Alright, so now when I put it back in my board, I'm going to line up my open end on the outside pin it together. Again, I'm pulling everything in so that it's tight and it won't move. And I'll just put a couple pins around the outside, mainly where the solder seams intersect. So like I got one here, I'll pull this in and I'll just put one there so it holds that one close to the solder seam, and here too. Now you've got to go and solder. So the first thing I'm going to do, just like when you started your panel, is you're just going to tack solder all the corners, because those corners are open. Okay, so you're going to just tack solder. You definitely don't want your iron plugged right into the thing. Okay, if it's plugged right in, it's going to be too hot, and you can actually melt your frame, and then you'll have to just cut another one, which will be a bummer. Okay, so probably make sure you turn it down to that 8 or so. The other thing is, this frame is has more mass than the foil, and so when you're soldering on the foil, the metal of the foil has to get hot enough to accept the solder. The solder can melt, but if the foil's not hot enough, it's not going to attach. But the foil's so thin, it doesn't take long to heat up. The mass of your frame will force you to slow down a little bit and solder a little bit longer, so the frame can heat up to 900 degrees or whatever, so that it'll accept that solder. Okay? Once you do the corners, then you'll pull out all your seams and attach to the frame. Not just pull out to the frame, but actually attach. Alright, so I'm going to demo that. So why don't you guys start coming in a little closer, because this is a little bit smaller. Let's see. The other thing for this application, you guys really don't need, in fact, you don't want the roll of solder. I always grab from this thing if I need any extra solder for this. Usually, there's enough solder on your actual iron to do the corners. Or if anything, you can just kind of pick up a bead or two like this. That's enough solder for your corners. You really don't want to over solder on your frame. I've also had people do this when they solder the corner. Sometimes they'll get too much solder on there, and I don't know why, but for some reason they feel like, well, I'll just solder the rest of the frame. And so they flux their whole frame and they try putting solder over the whole thing. Don't do that, okay? Put as little solder on this thing as you possibly can. It'll look a lot cleaner in the end. Alright, so I'm just going to put a little bit of flux on here. I'm being careful about where the flux goes. If I spread the flux way out, that's going to cause the solder to spread way out. If I keep the flux really located right on the corner there, right on the seam, then that's where my solder is going to go. And I want to make sure that I do that so that I don't overdo it. Again, I got to solder a little bit longer, so I'm just going to kind of give it a 5 count or so. See, that was even too much, but I'm plugged right into it. That was it. This one I melted already. Why? I wasn't plugged in first. To the rheostat. I'm plugged right into the wall here. Okay, we should have done that. Just a little blob on the corners is all you want, okay? Now I'm going to solder right up to the edge of this thing and pull my seams out. I'm sorry, flux right up to the edge, pull my seams out. I don't want to get the solder all the way on the surface of the frame. I just want it to connect to the edge of the frame. You guys feel like you're getting the hang of the soldering yet? No? It's all speed, how much solder you're adding. As long as you melt that whole seam and you pull the solder off, it's going to be pretty smooth and round. I did this side of this thing in probably 3 minutes before you guys walked in here. It's just a matter of making sure the solder gets hot enough, pulling those seams, making sure they're fluid and liquid before you pull your iron off. And again, I just want to attach this to the side of the frame, not so much the top. This one didn't attach. Again, if you are sloppy with your fluxing, the flux is going to allow the solder to go places you might not want it to go. So be careful when you're actually using that flux brush. This one's a little flat. Add a little bit more solder to that one. Okay, so now you've got your corners done and you've got your seams pulled out to the frame. What would you guess would be step number 2? Let's do the same thing on the back side, okay? I'm going to leave the back side because I'll show my other class later, but that's the same technique. You're getting the 4 corners first, just tacking them together, and then pulling your seams out. I'm going to leave this here, and I want you guys, before you go sit down at your seats, I want you to all come up and look at the corners, except this one that I botched and melted a little bit. I want you to look at the corners, and I want you to look at how the seams attach to the frame. Now this thing is totally permanent. I'm not going to pull the glass out of this thing or anything. It's a little bit loose right here. You can see that, but that's just because there's no seam for me to attach to, so there's not much I can do about that. So I want you, before you go sit down, to take a walk up here and take a look at this, okay? So for today, 7:47. So we've got a little bit of work time. How many people have yet to do any soldering?